So Chris Marshall rose to the position of ministerial servant in the Watchtower Society. He was a second-generation witness, and he worked his way to the Bethel headquarters, where he became a Bethelite, as they were known. And on a personal note, I am so proud of this fine young man. He began to date a friend of Dawn and I's, who knew that I was well-versed on Watchtower theology and wrote a book about it. And that this led to Chris and I starting to meet weekly for probably, I don't know, about 5 months, 4 or 5 months. And one of the happiest days of my life was when Chris walked in. You had a smile on your face that day, whether you realized it. I looked a little different, that something happened. And he just looked at me and said the words that I needed to hear. And he said, I could see the deity of Jesus Christ. You know, I want you to know that when a former Jehovah's Witness says, I recognize the deity of Christ, that's good enough for me. That's good enough for me. Yeah, let's give the Lord a hand clap for that, can we? Yeah. And then I had the honor of baptizing him just a few months later. And then just a few months after that, marrying him and his bride, who, by the way, is him and his bride, Christina, and I know she's watching in right now. They're going to be welcoming Emma Jean Marshall in about another month. So could we also give the Lord a hand clap for that? Their first child. But I remember sitting with him when he talked about baptism, and I looked him in the eye and said, are you sure? And I quoted the scripture verse where Jesus said, unless a man counts the cost, he doesn't build the house. I said, Chris, if you do this, your father and your stepmother, whom he loves, may never talk to you again. And they haven't talked to him in about 2.5, 5 years. 5 years they haven't talked to him. So when I say hero of the faith, like I referred to with, Martha as well, but Elaine, I'm looking at Elaine, I couldn't get her name out. I want you to meet another hero of the faith. His talk today is going to be powerful, and it's called Why I Am Not a Jehovah's Witness Today. Let's welcome Chris Marshall up here today. This is only his second time, so I'll just throw that in so he feels even more comfortable.
And it's always hard to talk after lunch, too. I feel like taking a nap, honestly. But I was raised a Jehovah's Witness, born and raised. My father and mom were raised Jehovah's Witnesses as well. And also my grandfather and grandmother were raised witnesses too. So I was taught at a very young age to be appreciative of my spiritual background. There's a picture of me and my sisters growing up, probably taking a photo before a congregation meeting. But my mother was disfellowshipped actually right after I was born. So my father worked really hard in raising us in the JW faith. He remarried after several years. You can probably flip the next slide. And my stepmother would take me out from door to door. She was a regular pioneer, so even before school, I would be with her going 70 hours a month in the field ministry. I yearned to be a regular pioneer too. I wanted to follow in my parents' footsteps. My parents instilled in me going to Bethel, and also being a pioneer as a parent would instill their child to go to college. It was something that was such a high goal for me. You can probably flip the next slide as well. I remember going to conventions as a young lad, and in the intermission points, they would have the Bethel meetings. There was always a Bethelite, or in this case, a governing body member that was there. We used to idolize these guys. We wanted to be them. We pretty much worshiped them. Looking back at it now, but it was something that I really wanted to do, was to go to Bethel. We would go to Bethel for summer vacations, when some parents or some families would go to the beach or, go see other family members, we would go up to Bethel. You can probably flip to the next slide. I used to love walking around, seeing the governing body's offices, seeing all the happy young faces, the young people. It seemed like so much fun. My elder sister was later disfellowshipped, and she went on to live with my birth mother, who was disfellowshipped also. And I remember at a young age, even before baptism, making the stand not to associate with my birth mother. I remember like it was just yesterday, my sister, the middle child, was about to be baptized. So my parents gave her an ultimatum. In order to get baptized, you have to stop communication with your birth mother. And I remember knocking on her door and just surprising her and saying, having my sister say, she doesn't want to associate because she's not living for Jehovah. And I saw how happy that made my parents and how proud they were of my sister. So I jumped right in that conversation as well and said, Mom, I don't want to associate with you as well because you're not a Jehovah's Witness anymore. That was very tough. I can only imagine how traumatic that was for her and how traumatic that was for my sister and myself as well. But I was later baptized and entered the full-time ministry shortly after that. I regular pioneered for several years. You can probably flip to the next slide. That was me. My dad's on the other side. I felt the need to cut him out because he's still in Bethel. But I attended pioneer school with my father. We downsized. We moved to where the need was greater. I eventually became a ministerial servant. I had several privileges and opportunities. You can probably flip to the next slide. Speaking at certain assembly halls and conventions as well. I felt at the time it really strengthened my faith. I was very young in my congregation, so I was used heavily. You can probably flip the next slide as well. I had the opportunity to go to Germany for the International Convention. And that's something that has always stuck with me, seeing the uniformity of the Jehovah's Witness faith, seeing them all meet together, that really stuck with me. And as a young man, that was really deceiving. The next slide, I went to Guatemala for about a month, preached there. And again, it was just faith-strengthening trips. But there was always fear behind each one of these trips. It was always fear behind each privilege you got. Fears like, am I going to make my 70 hours this month? You always hear of the pioneer that didn't make their hours. They're sent back into the elders' room. They're talked to. Even though those meetings are supposed to be somewhat encouraging, you always leave feeling like, man, I should have done more. I can always do more. I'm not doing enough. It's just exhausting. And you always feel guilty. I thought the more I did for Jehovah, the more he would find favor in me. I remember my dad telling me the more I actively served Jehovah, the less likely I was to sin. And I took those words very seriously. One analogy my stepmother told me that helped her stay out of trouble when she was younger. She imagined Jehovah over her head with a hammer. And if she were to sin or to, mess up, if Armageddon came, he would just slap that hammer right down on her. She would be no longer in existence. And I took that to heart too. That is what drove me to want to do more, to not fall into sin. My parents were accepted to Bethel. I remember my dad coming into my room at 19 explaining that they were going. I was so happy for them. I was somewhat devastated in a way because, I was living with my parents, but I wanted them to achieve that opportunity. And I was willing to make that sacrifice. So I moved out. I stayed with a brother on his property. I worked at his house for rent while working a full-time job, barely making ends meet, surviving on at least 1 or 2 meals a day if I could afford that. But I was later accepted into Bethel. Look at me cheesing. I was so happy. My dreams were coming true. This is what I always wanted. This is what my parents strove for. This is why they worked so hard. This is why they sacrificed so much. This is why I sacrificed so much for this moment right here. But I started having doubts shortly after being in Bethel. Being raised in the JW faith, they preach Bethel in the Watchtower and in meetings as the closest thing to paradise earth. It really is the closest thing to paradise earth. I imagined my stay there would be uplifting. I'd be around the most spiritual people in the whole organization, but I was definitely wrong. I found myself bullied a lot of the times when I was there. There was a lot of jealousy and this feeling of we're better than everybody else because we are Bethelites. You're not. I understand people are imperfect, but Bethel was just not what it was advertised by the organization to be. I remember visiting home for a short while and speaking with brothers about my time at Bethel. And it shocked me to hear what they had to say. Some of the same brothers that encouraged me to go to Bethel, they mentioned, oh man, I would never send my kids to Bethel. And all I can think of is, why'd you encourage me to go? And I just kept wondering myself, like, is this right? Certain little flashes would come up in my mind, like, man, is this really real? Is this right? Around the same time, I also discovered many years ago, a brother molested a child in my hall, in my Christian congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. He and his wife actually ran a daycare too. And not only was this brother allowed to continue to run the daycare, but they didn't go to the authorities. They didn't go to the police. Nothing was brought up that was aware of my knowledge. I'm sure he was dealt with behind closed doors, but he was dealt with by the wrong people, not the authorities. When I went to the elders to discuss my frustrations over this, I was assured that all the proper measures were taken, but that just didn't sit right with me. I was later disfellowshipped after coming back home from spending a year in Bethel. I remember sitting in the back room with the 3 elders, discussing what I did, what I'd done. I remember them asking me to leave the room, and I was sitting in this dark auditorium and just begging, crying and begging, Lord Jehovah, please just forgive me. And a thought popped up in my mind, and I could see the elders sitting in the room, and they weren't going over their Bibles, they weren't praying, they were looking at this piece of paper given to them by the faithful and discreet slave on how to handle me. And I was just thinking, man, how do they know if I'm repentant or not? They're not God, they don't know me. How do they know if I'm repentant? But needless to say, I was disfellowshipped. I remember my father's words when I told him. He assured me he loved me. I will always be his son, his only son, but unfortunately, he loved the organization more. He loved Jehovah God more. That was hard to hear. I was shortly fired from my job, which was a company owned and ran by Jehovah's Witnesses. I had nowhere to go, no money to my name, nowhere to sleep except my car. I just remember feeling so lonely, so depressed. I even had thoughts of suicide. I thought, anything is better than this. I have no one, I have nothing. After the many phone calls I've made to my friends and family, asking, can I just stay with you just for a few nights so I can get myself back on my feet? After hearing no and no, I thought I'd go through with my plan of suicide. I made one more phone call to my grandmother, who was actually inactive at the time, and she allowed me to stay with her. Being inactive in the Jehovah's Witness faith means you're not doing your field ministry enough, or you're not going to every meeting enough the way you should be. So they label you inactive, meaning just to be cautious of this one in the congregation, because something is obviously not right if you're not going out in field ministry 70 hours a month. Right before I was disfellowshipped, I remember the elders telling me to say goodbye to all my family and friends. And they encouraged me to go to the meeting where I was going to be announced as being disfellowshipped. And talk about embarrassment. They used to do it in the middle of the meeting, and you'd have to sit through the whole meeting while people looked back at you or went to the bathroom and cut eyes at you. But they recently moved it to the end of the meeting when I was disfellowshipped, and I just remember the gasps, the traumatic gasps, and the people that I grew up with, just looking at me like, what did you do? What have you done? And I remember as soon as I was announced, I just grabbed my psalm book and Bible and just left, looking the other direction as I walked through the door. I was disfellowshipped for almost 2 years, though. At this point, I moved to a different state. I started attending the meetings there. I remember going to the elders so many times through those, a year and a half to 2 years, just asking for forgiveness. Please bring me back, man. I'm repentant. I've stopped, sinning. I went to the elders, first when I was first disfellowshipped regarding, what I was going through, and I was punished. So that has to stand for something. I'm coming to you guys. Please help me. And they kept refusing, and they kept refusing. And I kept wondering, how do these imperfect men know if I'm repentant or not? I just want to see my dad again. I just want to see my family, my grandparents. I want to see my friends. That was a real traumatic experience, but I was shortly reinstated after that time. But after being reinstated, I was definitely treated differently. A lot of my friends that I grew up with did not socialize with me, and what I worked so hard to get back into was just so different. I remember elders coming up to me after getting certain privileges back or making certain comments at the meetings, and they would always say, kind of in a disrespectful way, "Oh man, you would be going places if you didn't slip up," or "Oh man, I can only see what you would be now if you did not, fall short." And I just remember just being so depressed. Again, I made it all the way back. I struggled through those year and a half to 2 years. I'm back in the organization, but man, I feel more depressed than I ever had. The joy I had at first was definitely gone. I had a meeting with the elders shortly after that and expressed to them some of the concerns I had regarding the organization. I started doing some secular research because I felt the need to, because things were just not adding up. And I remember in the meeting them telling me that, hey, you need to be very careful. Whatever secular research you're doing that's not a part of the Watchtower or the organization, it's just like viewing pornography. They wanted me to stop, and I wasn't. What I was looking up was really good information, and I wanted answers. So they disfellowshipped me again. I remembered in this particular meeting, the elders didn't even bother to open up their Bible. Usually, there's always like a goodbye scripture, so to speak, to send you on your way, but there wasn't even that. And at this time, I knew I believed in God or some type of a higher force, but I didn't know what that was. And I was really lost at this time, being disfellowshipped twice. I actually went to two churches, which was really hard to do because I knew that was being an apostate. That's the last thing you want to do. If you ever see a video of the governing body or anyone talk about being apostate, they speak about it as worse being than Satan the devil himself. And going to these churches, those conversations and such of false religion popped back into my mind. Things like passing around the collection plate, and being too political in the church, and not being united was really hard for me. It scared me. I actually didn't go back for quite some time. Again, I was very depressed, and I didn't know what to do. And I turned to alcohol. I turned to marijuana. I turned to just about anything that could get me, some type of high of some sort, some spiritual high or something in that nature. I would say close to my lowest point, I thought, okay, I know I can do better. I wasn't raised this way. I will do better. Maybe I should work my way back up to being a Jehovah's Witness again. So after cleaning my act up a little bit, I met a woman that came into my work one day, and she's now my wife, Christina. We started to build a relationship together. We really hit it off, and she told me about a pastor that dealt with a lot of witnesses, and I was turned off from wanting to go down that path. I did not want to speak to anyone about, anyone who wasn't a witness about the witnesses. I was very hesitant, but I met with Al anyway, and he assured me that not everything I learned from the witnesses was wrong. That they do have it right in some aspects of certain things, and that was encouraging. That was good for me to hear. If someone would have came at me saying, what you learned was wrong, everything you were taught is a lie, I would have been so turned off. I probably would have walked away. But hearing that reassurance was enough for me to keep going back week after week. We took one topic at a time. We spent extra time on things that really bothered me: blood transfusions, voting. Most importantly, is Jesus God? That was hard. The Trinity can be very confusing, especially from someone who grew up a witness. I was encouraged to do my own research and continue to do my own research, which was very unheard of. And I delved even deeper into, looking up YouTube videos. I saw Elaine's videos. That was really encouraging. I saw some other great videos that meant a lot to me. The information just blew my mind that I wasn't alone in this. There's a lot of other people that feel the same way that I do, that are here for me. Some of the most kindergarten Bible truths really opened my eyes for the first time. I remember my wife telling me about grace. There was no grace in the New World Translation. I had no idea what that word meant, grace. And to have that explained to me just brought me to tears. I remember thinking that, that's true love, grace, right there. That's Jesus, love. Not disfellowshipping, not shaming, but grace. I'll probably flip to the next slide. I was later baptized at the Greater Grace Church that same year. That's me. That's Pastor Al. That was such a proud moment in my life. I enjoyed that tremendously. It's still a battle every day, though. I miss my family. I miss my friends. I think about the young one I'm about to have with my wife, and I think about, man, she's not going to meet her grandparents. She's not going to meet her great-grandparents. It's sad, but I feel such security knowing the actual truth, and that's the truth right there. I feel blessed to experience all that I have experienced. I feel grateful that my eyes were open to true Christianity, but most importantly, my eyes were open to Christ, the one and only. So if you're still struggling, whether you are a Jehovah's Witness looking out, or if you're no longer a witness but your mind is still in there, just don't stop praying. Pray to Jesus. Find support outside of the JW faith. I mean, I still need support every day. Just on the flight up here, I was thinking to myself, man, why am I doing this? Jeez. Or do I want to speak again at a conference? You know, why am I putting myself through this? And I had just reaffirmed myself that, I'm doing this for Jesus, man. I'm doing this for him. I'm doing this for other ones who are in my shoes, who have been there. It's difficult to leave and physically go against everything you've been engraved to believe. And so many years and sacrifices cultivating, what you've learned. But this scripture always stuck out with me, Matthew 10:38 through 40. And it actually reads, "Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it." And that's exactly what you're doing, whether it's Jehovah's Witness, Mormon, or any cult. When you leave, you're leaving your life behind. You're leaving your friends, your family, everything you cultivated behind. But man, how refreshing, verse 39, "For my sake you will find that again." And verse 40, "Anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me." Powerful. Thank you.